Hello, my name is Carolyn Wilkins, and I'm here to talk with you about my new book. My book is called They Raised Me Up, A Black Single Mother and the Women Who Inspired Her. In 1986, I left a disastrous marriage behind in Washington State, and I moved to the outskirts of Boston. I was a single mother with a 4-year-old daughter. I had no money, I had no plan, and basically I had no clue. But my dream was to become a jazz musician, and I thought that I could do that better in Boston than in Tacoma. Plus, my marriage was kind of a disaster. So, They Raised Me Up is the story of my first year here. And in the book, I write about the adventures that I had along the way, which were many. But also, I write about the 5 women who inspired me to keep going. And these were women from my past. 3 of them, I'd had 3 ancestors in the past who had tried to do what I was doing to some degree or another. They were musically talented, they sang, they wrote music, they played the piano, they were trying to do things, but the time wasn't right. Times were difficult. They were black. It was 1900. They lived in Alabama. 2 of them were single mothers themselves and struggled with how to support a child and how to be a musician and how to be a black woman in 1900. Later in Harlem, my grandmother lived in Harlem in 1940, and I write about what that was like. She lived down the street from Duke Ellington and across the street from Lionel Hampton. She saw Paul Robeson perform. She had quite a lively life, and her motto was to celebrate the beautiful. She taught all of her children that. And she wanted very much, I think, to be able to do something with her music, but once again, the times weren't right. When I'm trying to decide if I'm going to buy a book, I always flip it open, right, and read the first few pages. Here's how it starts. Chapter 1, Carolyn and Sarah, Somerville, Massachusetts, August 1986. Blam! A heavy object thuds against my bedroom wall, startling me from a deep sleep. Heart pounding, I prop myself up on one elbow and listen intently. Silence. I squint at the clock on the cardboard box beside my bed. 1:45 a.m. Stumbling into the bathroom, I press my ear against the wall. The banging has stopped. I tiptoe back into the bedroom to check on my daughter. If Sarah wakes up now, there'll be no getting her back to sleep for the rest of the night. Fortunately, my 4-year-old continues to sleep peacefully, sprawled in the center of the sagging double bed we share. As always, she's wearing her favorite pair of PJs, the pink ones with the polka dots and the booties on the feet. And, as always, my daughter has her thumb in her mouth. Of course I know it's bad for her, but I just can't bring myself to make her stop. Over this past year, Sarah has watched her parents fight more often than I care to admit. If she needs to suck her thumb to cope with the stress, I am not going to stop her. I lift the covers and slide back into the bed next to her. Blam! The thud of something falling in the next apartment rattles the only picture on my wall, a colorful Romar Bearden print of jazz musicians I'd bought 3 months ago to celebrate my divorce. This time the banging is accompanied by the sound of voices. A man's yelling, a woman's high-pitched screams. I can't make out what they're saying, but clearly something ugly is taking place. A minute later, I hear the sound of running footsteps, and the voices retreat, presumably to the other end of their apartment. For the 10th time this week, I ask myself whether it was a mistake for me to leave Tacoma. For the 10th time this week, I remind myself that if I'm ever going to realize my dream of making it in the music business, Boston is the place I need to be, at least for now. Maybe one day I can move to New York City, the mecca of the jazz universe. But I am a black single mother with a 4-year-old biracial baby and no money. At the moment, living in Somerville, a working-class suburb on the edge of Boston, is difficult enough. So, as the chapter continues, I lie in bed, I listen to these people fight, I brood about my divorce, I brood about what I'm going to do, how I'm ever going to get out of this situation. And eventually the fighting escalates, and it sounds like he's throwing this woman up against the wall. And she's screaming, and I realize that I do need to get involved. And finally, I go into the kitchen and I call the police. Here's what happens next. I poured myself a glass of milk and sat down at the kitchen table to wait for the police. I tried not to think about how tired I was going to be at work the next day, or how on earth I'd find the energy to be a good mother when I got home later that night. I was going to have to follow the all-purpose advice my grandmother Alberta had been famous for dispensing. She used to say, "Child, you got to put it in the hands of the Lord." Grandmother Alberta died in 1965 when I was 12. But Mom said I looked and acted just like her. To hear my mother tell it, I had inherited my grandmother's musical abilities, along with her spunk, her high Indian cheekbones, and her rich soprano voice. According to family legend, my great-grandfather had disappeared when Alberta was just a baby, leaving my great-grandmother Lily to raise their child alone. That would have made my great-grandmother a single mother just like me. I wondered what my great-grandmother would have made of my current situation. Back in the early 1900s, Lily Pruitt had been a black woman raising a child alone in Alabama. Bet she'd have had plenty of down-home advice to offer, I thought, taking another sip of milk. Wonder if she ever had to call the cops on her next-door neighbors. As I stared absently out the window, the strangest feeling came over me. Yes, my marriage had failed, and yes, I was flat broke, struggling to realize my quixotic dream in an unfamiliar and dangerous place. But in spite of everything, I suddenly felt at peace, as if a woman inside was whispering in my ear. You come from a long line of survivors, Carolyn. Women who, when faced with slavery and segregation, never ever gave up. You are stronger than you know.